The People's Republic of China's aggressive and provocative behavior in the maritime territorial disputes represents a threat to vital U.S. interests as severe as those from Russia, Iran, North Korea, and terrorism from the Middle East. According to the Heritage Foundation's 2017 Index for U.S. Military Strength, since 2013, China has rapidly advanced its maritime capabilities, employed them to transform the South China Sea with artificial islands, place Japan under increasing pressure in the East China Sea, and attempt to restrict freedoms of navigation in its near waters. Unbelievably, China has suffered little, if any, cost for this maritime push. In the South China Sea, China has built over 3,200 acres of land over disputed features in the Spratly Islands, complete with military-capable airstrips, ports, radars, anti-aircraft weapons, and confirmed just last week surface-to-air missile silos.
There are 20 maritime disputes that do not involve China, and not a single one of them has been the subject or even a partial subject of any hearing of this subcommittee, any subcommittee, or the full committee of Foreign Affairs. Why? Because none of those disputes justify a massive increase in the American military budget, and none of those disputes distract us sufficiently from the war that China is waging against American working families.
Our new Secretary of State, Tillerson, warned of a more confrontational South China Sea policy, but also said that the island building had to stop and that access to those islands would not be allowed. The President has recognized the One China policy, as we all know. The last administration expressed a floor for China, including the militarization of the South China Sea. But as far as I can tell, that was never backed up, never backed up in the last with any action. So the question is, so if we're going to maintain that there is a floor for China, what specific conditions should we articulate to China regarding that? And when China invariably breaks the floor or floors, what should our actions be?
We should be treating our allies and our friends at least as well as we treat China. So I think that the incorporation of China into things like RIMPAC, when forces from, for example, the Republic of China, Taiwan, are excluded, sends, I think, a very distinct message to Beijing, especially when they show up not only with the forces that are supposed to show up, but also spy ships, which were uninvited. And yet we are apparently going to invite them yet again. They showed up in 2014 with a spy ship as well as their forces. They showed up in 2016. And now apparently we're going to invite them again in 2018. That isn't even a floor. That's not a net. That's an open doorway.
We'll go to Ms. Gabbard from the great state of Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here and sharing your insights and thoughts. No one's really talked about North Korea yet and how the various courses of action that are being suggested here will impact the very direct threat that we face from North Korea, and the reality that any resolution to North Korea's situation will require the engagement and cooperation of China in that. So I'd love to just hear each of your thoughts on specifically how you suggest your suggested course of action will impact and the threat we face from North Korea. Let me start with Dr. Chang.
Representative, frankly, I don't see any solution to North Korea because the North Korean regime has associated itself with retaining its nuclear capability, and China has repeatedly demonstrated for pretty much the last 30 years it has no intention of solving the North Korean problem, particularly for the United States. And the reality is that North Korea's nuclear weapons aren't aimed at China. They are aimed at Japan, South Korea, and the United States, which from the Chinese perspective is not a great solution, but not necessarily a particularly troubling one. I will note, however, that the one time that anything was done that truly caught the North Korean regime's attention was when we shut down Banco Delta Asia by using the financial networks to force the Chinese, again, to make that choice. The millions of dollars that they gained from working with North Korea were the billions of dollars in financial flows that would otherwise occur. Unfortunately, after less than a year, we decided that those sanctions were too dangerous to continue and sustain against North Korea.
Thank you.
Congresswoman, thank you. I'd agree with my colleague. I would say, however, I'd modify it slightly to say that there are no good solutions to North Korea. There are lots of bad solutions to North Korea. And I agree entirely that we have to give up the fiction that China wants in any way to solve North Korea, certainly for our own purposes. I would say, however, that given the increasing erratic nature of the Kim Jong-un regime, the assassination of his half-brother, who was protected by China just a few weeks ago in Malaysia, as well as the assassination in 2014 or 13 of Chang Song-tek, who was Kim Jong-un's uncle, but more importantly, China's main agent in North Korea, means that Beijing is as worried about their influence as we are worried about our lack of. And there may be opportunities out of pure self-interest, which is a fine thing, for the two of us to figure out ways of pressuring that regime, or at least talking more creatively about how to contain it. At some point, by the way, we are going to have to decide when we declare it a nuclear power. It is a nuclear power. I understand that we do not want to shred the nonproliferation regime, but we're going to have to wake up to reality one day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I agree with what Dean and Misha have said already, that this is not a problem with a solution. I mean, it's really trying to maximize or optimize a bad situation. And unfortunately, what drives this situation the most is the behavior of North Korea, which no country outside of North Korea has real control over, including the Chinese. I believe that the Chinese have moved in their position towards a greater degree of cooperation and support in dealing with North Korea. They certainly wouldn't fully endorse everything that the United States might want to see toward North Korea for legitimate national security interests of their own, as well as other interests which may not be, as from our perspective, as legitimate. But I do think that we have choices here. We have the policy thus far has not worked. So we need to think about a new way of addressing this issue. We can't simply regard the Chinese as being the panacea, that they're going to solve it, because they're not going to solve it. So we have to think about how we can work with the Chinese, the South Koreans, and the Japanese to deal with it. We have two different paths that we can go. One of them is towards a greater degree of unified sanctions against North Korea in the hope that the regime will collapse or give up its nuclear weapons. I think that's very unlikely. I think they're committed to these weapons, and they're not likely to give them up. And they're going to continue to move towards a deliverable ICBM capability with a nuclear warhead. And when they get close to that capability, the question is, what do we do about that? And in my view, the only thing that one can do is you have to make a choice between being, well, you can combine both. You can be extremely clear about the consequences of any use or threat of use of a nuclear weapon by North Korea, that it involved the destruction of North Korea, and that this applies to threats to South Korea and to Japan, our allies, for whom we have a nuclear umbrella. And at the same time, however, I think we have to consider whether or not it's possible to develop a diplomatic strategy in which you address each of the concerns that the North Koreans have said that they have on their security front. Many people say this is all useless because the North Koreans will ignore all this and continue to take advantage of it. But you can make the argument that the United States and the other powers have not fully tried to implement what you call an omnibus approach to North Korea that would give them, over a period of time, in response to certain actions that they would take, a certain level of benefits for them, economic and diplomatic. And if they turn those things down and you offer them all in good faith and the Chinese sign on to that, then the basis for the Chinese to continue to not cooperate in dealing with North Korea will be reduced, in my view.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
There are clearly no easy answers to the situation, but Dr. Swain, I would argue that the time to ask that question, what will we do, is now, and understand that as we look at these other issues, whether it be the South China Sea or other issues within the region, we can't operate in a silo with any of them because of the ripple effects that will occur as we look at the various threats that exist there. Thank you.